My name is Isaiah Sterling, and the worst thing that ever happened to me began with a promise. I was 9 years old when my parents drove me across Atlanta and told me they would be back in a few minutes. At the time, I believed them without hesitation. Why wouldn't I? My father was a respected pastor. My mother volunteered at church every week. They spent years teaching me about honesty, faith, and family. They taught me that God never abandons his children. What they never taught me was what it feels like when your own parents abandon you first. Even now, 23 years later, I can still remember every detail of that day. Some memories fade with time. That one never did. It lives inside me as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The drive started just after lunch. My father, Calvin Sterling, barely spoke. Normally, he loved hearing himself talk. He could turn a 10-minute drive into a 1-hour sermon. But that afternoon, his hand stayed locked on the steering wheel and his eyes never left the road. My mother, Patricia, sat quietly beside him, staring out the passenger window. Every time I tried starting a conversation, I received short answers or no answer at all. At first, I thought they were tired. Then I thought maybe they were arguing. Eventually, I convinced myself they were planning a surprise. Children always choose the explanation that hurts the least. When we arrived at the Greyhound station, I noticed my father opening the trunk and pulling out a small duffel bag. It took me several seconds to recognize it. Then I realized it belonged to me. The bag contained a few shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, socks, underwear, and my favorite comic book. Looking back, that should have terrified me. Instead, I smiled. I thought we were going on a trip. I thought adventure was waiting. I had no idea that my entire childhood was about to end. Inside the station, people hurried in every direction. Travelers dragged suitcases behind them. Children ran through the waiting area. A television near the ceiling played a daytime talk show. The smell of coffee and diesel fuel filled the air. Everything felt normal. We sat on an empty bench near the center of the station. My mother reached over and smoothed my hair. Her hand trembled slightly. I remember noticing it and asking if she was cold. She forced a smile and said she was fine. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a $10 bill. "Your father and I need to take care of something," she said. "Stay right here. We'll be back before you know it." $10. That was all they left me. $10 and a lie. At the time, I didn't know that. I folded the bill carefully and placed it in my pocket. "Can I get a soda?" I asked. "Of course," she replied. Then she kissed my forehead. My father stood and nodded toward the exit. "Be good," he said. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me as my father. I watched them walk toward the doors. I expected one of them to look back. Neither did. The automatic doors opened. They stepped outside. The doors closed. I never saw them again. At first, I wasn't worried. Parents leave children waiting all the time. Maybe they needed gas. Maybe they forgot something. Maybe they were meeting someone. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 40. Every time the doors opened, I looked up, expecting to see them return. Every time they closed, disappointment settled a little deeper into my chest. After an hour, I bought a soda. After another hour, I bought a small bag of chips. I kept checking the entrance. I kept believing. I kept waiting. By late afternoon, I started feeling nervous. By evening, I felt scared. I walked outside several times to search the parking lot. My father's car was gone. I remember staring at the empty space where it had been parked and feeling a strange knot form in my stomach. Something felt wrong. Deep down, some part of me already knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to accept it. Children will invent 1,000 excuses before believing their parents no longer want them. I did exactly that. Maybe they had an emergency. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they were hurt. Maybe someone stole their car. Maybe they were looking for me somewhere else. Every explanation sounded ridiculous, but I clung to them anyway because the alternative was unbearable. As darkness settled outside, the station changed. Families disappeared. Travelers boarded buses. New people arrived while old faces vanished. Life moved forward around me while I remained trapped on that bench. Around 8 o'clock, an older employee noticed me sitting alone. She approached carefully and asked where my parents were. "They'll be back soon," I answered immediately. She looked toward the entrance. Then she looked back at me. Something in her expression changed. It was the same expression I would later see from social workers, police officers, foster parents, and teachers. Pity. At the time, I didn't understand why she was looking at me that way. She bought me a sandwich and a bottle of water. I thanked her but barely touched either one. My eyes never left the entrance. Another hour passed. Then another. The employee eventually spoke with a coworker. Both of them glanced in my direction repeatedly. Shortly before midnight, two police officers walked through the station doors and headed straight toward me. One was older with gray hair, the other looked young enough to be someone's older brother. The older officer crouched beside me. "What's your name, son?" he asked gently. "Isaiah Sterling." "And where are your parents?" "They went somewhere. They'll be back." The officers exchanged a glance. Even then, I didn't understand. They asked questions. I answered every one of them. My parents' names, my address, my school, my phone number. The older officer stepped away and made several calls. I watched him speak quietly into the phone while occasionally looking in my direction. The conversation lasted several minutes. Then another call, then another. Each time his expression grew more serious. Eventually he returned. "Isaiah," he said carefully, "we can't reach your parents." "Try again," I replied. "They're probably driving." He nodded and walked away. 10 minutes later, he returned with the same answer. No response, no voicemail, no explanation, nothing. The station employee sat beside me while the officers continued making calls. Midnight turned into 1 o'clock in the morning. The waiting area was nearly empty by then. My fear had grown into something much worse. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in complete darkness. You know something terrible is below you. You just can't see it yet. Around 1:30, the younger officer sat across from me. "Do you have any relatives we can call?" he asked. I listed grandparents, cousins, and an aunt I barely knew. More phone calls followed. One by one, every possibility disappeared. Nobody knew where my parents were. Nobody expected them. Nobody had heard from them. The younger officer rubbed the back of his neck and looked away. The older officer stared at the floor. For the first time all night, nobody seemed to know what to say. Then I asked the question that changed everything. Did something happen to them? The two officers looked at each other. Neither answered immediately. Finally, the older one spoke. "We don't know." But his face told a different story. For the first time that night, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me far more than being alone. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't concern. It wasn't uncertainty. It was pity. Deep, painful pity. And in that moment, something inside me began to break. Because even before anyone said the words out loud, I finally understood what every adult in that station already knew. My parents were not lost. They were not delayed. They were not coming back. They had left me there on purpose. They had left me there on purpose. That realization should have made me cry harder. Instead, something strange happened. I stopped crying completely. The tears disappeared as if someone had turned off a faucet inside my body. I sat silently on that plastic bench staring at the floor while the two police officers spoke quietly with the Greyhound employee. I was only 9 years old, but for the first time in my life I understood what true loneliness felt like. Not the loneliness of being by yourself for a few hours, not the loneliness of sitting alone at lunch. This was something much deeper. It was the feeling of discovering that the two people you trusted most in the world had decided you were no longer worth keeping. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the older officer gently informed me that they were taking me somewhere safe for the night. I remember refusing at first. I kept insisting that my parents might come back. I kept telling them they were making a mistake. The officer listened patiently until I finally ran out of arguments. Then he picked up my duffel bag and held out his hand. Looking back, I realized he was trying to make the situation feel less frightening. At the time, it felt like the final confirmation that my old life was over. I climbed into the back seat of the police car and watched the bus station disappear through the window. Every few seconds I looked back, hoping to see my parents' car pull into the parking lot. It never happened. We arrived at a temporary youth shelter shortly before dawn. The building looked more like an office than a home. A tired woman behind a desk asked me dozens of questions, while another employee brought me a blanket and a pillow. Eventually, someone showed me to a small room containing 2 beds. The other bed was empty. I sat on the edge of the mattress, clutching my comic book and waiting for someone to tell me this had all been a misunderstanding. Nobody did. The next morning, I woke up expecting my parents to be there. They weren't. I expected them the following day. They weren't there either. Then a week passed. Then two. Then a month. Every time a phone rang, my heart jumped. Every time an adult entered the room, I wondered if they had news. None of them ever did. A social worker named Rebecca became responsible for my case. She was kind, patient, and honest. Unfortunately, honesty was the last thing I wanted. I wanted lies. I wanted someone to tell me my parents were searching for me. I wanted someone to promise everything would return to normal. Rebecca refused to make promises she couldn't keep. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the abandonment, I finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Did they say why? Rebecca lowered her eyes. No. Did they call? No. Do they want me back? The silence that followed answered the question before she ever spoke. That was the day something broke inside me. Not dramatically. Not all at once. More like a crack spreading through glass. From that moment forward, I stopped expecting rescue. A few months later, I entered the foster care system. Before that happened, I imagined foster care as a place where families helped children who needed support. Reality was far more complicated. Some foster parents were good people trying their best. Others viewed children like temporary obligations attached to monthly checks. Some homes felt safe, others felt cold. None of them felt permanent. During my first 3 years in the system, I moved 7 different times. Just when I started making friends, I was transferred. Just when I learned the rules of one household, I found myself living in another. Every move taught the same lesson. Never get too comfortable. Never unpack completely. Never assume anything will last. The hardest part wasn't the moving. It was the waiting. Every birthday felt like a test. Every Christmas felt like a test. Deep down, I kept believing my parents would eventually come back. Maybe they would realize they made a mistake. Maybe guilt would finally catch up with them. Maybe they would remember they had a son. My 10th birthday came and went. Nothing. Christmas arrived. Nothing. My 11th birthday passed. Nothing. Another Christmas. Nothing. Year after year, hope slowly died from neglect. By the time I turned 12, I had stopped checking the mail. I had stopped asking social workers for updates. I had stopped imagining reunions. The Sterling family had erased me from their lives, and I was finally beginning to accept that fact. Around that same time, I started getting into fights at school. Not because I enjoyed fighting, because anger was easier than sadness. Every insult felt personal. Every joke felt like an attack. Every authority figure became an enemy. Teachers described me as difficult. Foster parents described me as withdrawn. The truth was much simpler. I was hurt. I was furious. And I had no idea what to do with either emotion. Everything changed because of a school librarian named Mrs. Turner. One afternoon, after I got suspended for punching another student, she found me sitting alone in the library. Instead of lecturing me, she handed me a book. It was the biography of a businessman who grew up in poverty and built a fortune from nothing. I wasn't interested, she insisted anyway. Out of boredom more than curiosity, I started reading. Then something unexpected happened. For the first time, I saw people who had survived terrible childhoods and still created extraordinary lives. I discovered entrepreneurs who started with nothing, investors who overcame impossible odds, leaders who transformed pain into motivation. Their stories fascinated me because they offered something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Not hope that my parents would return, hope that my future might be different from my past. From that day forward, books became my escape. While other kids played video games, I sat in libraries reading everything I could find about business, money, investing, psychology, negotiation, and success. I read before school. I read after school. I read during lunch. Knowledge became the one thing nobody could take away from me. The more I learned, the more I realized something important. The people who controlled their lives usually controlled their finances. Money wasn't everything, but it provided choices. Choices created freedom. Freedom created power. For a boy who had spent years feeling powerless, that realization changed everything. By 13, I was mowing lawns for extra cash. By 14, I was helping neighbors clean garages and move furniture. By 15, I was saving nearly every dollar I earned. Other teenagers dreamed about cars and video games. I dreamed about never needing anyone again. Every dollar represented security. Every dollar represented independence. Every dollar represented one more step away from the frightened child sitting alone in a Greyhound station. Yet despite all my progress, one question continued following me everywhere. Why? Why had they done it? What was so wrong with me that my own parents decided I wasn't worth keeping? I asked myself that question thousands of times, sometimes while lying awake at night, sometimes while studying, sometimes while staring at old photographs I secretly carried from foster home to foster home. No matter how hard I searched, the answer never came. Eventually, I stopped looking for it. Instead, I made a decision. If my parents wanted me forgotten, I would become impossible to ignore. If they wanted me erased, I would build a life too large to erase. If they thought abandoning me had ended my story, I would make sure it became the beginning instead. That decision became my obsession. It drove every choice I made, every hour I studied, every job I accepted, every sacrifice I endured. The Sterling family had taken my childhood. I swore they would never take my future. And although I didn't know it then, that promise would eventually turn a frightened foster kid into one of the wealthiest men in America. And although I didn't know it then, that promise would eventually turn a frightened foster kid into one of the wealthiest men in America. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There was no miracle, no secret inheritance, and no generous stranger who suddenly changed my life. There was only discipline, obsession, and a level of determination that bordered on unhealthy. By the time I graduated high school, I had already accepted something most adults spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Nobody was coming to save me. The sooner I accepted responsibility for my future, the faster my future began to change. I worked every job I could find. I stocked shelves before sunrise, cleaned offices after dark, delivered groceries on weekends, and spent every spare moment reading books about business and investing. While other teenagers spent money as quickly as they earned it, I treated every dollar like a soldier in an army I was building. Every dollar had a mission. Every dollar had a purpose. My goal wasn't comfort. My goal was freedom. A guidance counselor eventually helped me secure scholarships that allowed me to attend college. Walking onto that campus felt like stepping into another world. Most students worried about grades, relationships, and weekend parties. I worried about survival. I carried years of anger, abandonment, and insecurity into every classroom. For a long time, I felt like an outsider pretending to belong. But while many students treated college like an experience, I treated it like a weapon. I studied economics, finance, accounting, and investment theory with an intensity that alarmed some of my professors. Knowledge had rescued me once before. I believed it could do it again. During my sophomore year, one professor changed the direction of my life forever. He introduced me to the world of private investing. The idea fascinated me immediately. Wealth wasn't created through luck. It wasn't created through wishful thinking. Wealth was created by understanding value before everyone else recognized it. That realization consumed me. I spent countless nights studying market trends, business models, financial statements, and investor psychology. While my classmates slept, I remained in the library surrounded by spreadsheets and annual reports. The more I learned, the more opportunities I started seeing. Small opportunities at first, then larger ones, then opportunities that changed everything. After graduation, I accepted an entry-level position at a financial consulting firm. The pay was modest, but the education was priceless. For the first time, I gained access to boardrooms, investors, business owners, and financial strategies that most people never see. I listened more than I spoke. I observed more than I participated. Every meeting became a classroom. Every mistake became a lesson. Within 5 years, I had saved enough money to launch my first investment partnership. It wasn't glamorous. My office was small. My team consisted of only 3 people. My furniture looked like it came from a yard sale, but for the first time in my life, I was building something that belonged entirely to me, something nobody could take away. The first few years were brutal. Deals failed. Investors walked away. Markets crashed. More than once, I came dangerously close to losing everything, but every setback reminded me of that bus station. Every obstacle reminded me of the little boy nobody wanted. Compared to abandonment, business failure didn't seem nearly as frightening. So I kept going. One successful investment became three, three became 10, 10 became 50. By the time I turned 35, the small partnership had evolved into Sterling Capital Group, a firm managing hundreds of millions of dollars. By 40, that number had grown into billions. Financial magazines started calling me a visionary investor. Business networks requested interviews. Industry conferences paid enormous speaking fees. People who once ignored me now competed for my attention. Yet despite the success, despite the money, despite the recognition, one question continued following me everywhere. Why? Why had they abandoned me? The question never disappeared. It simply grew quieter as the years passed. Then, one evening, everything changed. I was reviewing a potential acquisition when I received an email from a private investigator I had hired months earlier. At first, the investigation had been nothing more than curiosity. I wanted to know whether my parents were alive. I wanted to know whether they ever thought about me. I wanted answers. What I received instead was a 27-page report that kept me awake until sunrise. According to the report, Calvin Sterling had become one of Atlanta's most respected religious leaders. His church, Greater Light Ministries, had grown from a small congregation into a regional powerhouse, attracting thousands of members every week. Television appearances, radio interviews, community awards, charity events, and political connections had transformed him into a local celebrity. Patricia remained by his side. Together, they presented themselves as champions of faith, family values, and community leadership. The hypocrisy nearly made me laugh. The man who abandoned his own child was now giving sermons about responsibility and compassion. But that wasn't the most surprising discovery. My parents had another child, my older sister, Chloe. Unlike me, she had never been abandoned. Unlike me, she had enjoyed every opportunity life could provide: expensive schools, luxury vacations, elite social circles. The report described her as active in charity work and church leadership. Publicly, she appeared successful. Privately, however, the situation looked different. Married to a real estate developer named Jamal Richardson, Chloe was living far beyond her means. Multiple businesses struggled financially. Several loans appeared dangerously overextended. Significant debt existed beneath the surface. None of it was public knowledge yet, but the warning signs were obvious to anyone with financial experience. The deeper I read, the more fascinated I became. For 23 years, I had imagined my parents living ordinary lives. Instead, they had built an empire. An empire founded on the image of integrity. An empire built while pretending I had never existed. I should have felt angry. Instead, I felt curious. Very curious. Over the next several months, I ordered additional investigations. More reports arrived, more details emerged. Every document revealed another layer of the Sterling family's carefully constructed world. They were wealthy, influential, respected. But they were also vulnerable in ways they didn't yet understand. The most interesting discovery arrived nearly a year later. Greater Light Ministries was hosting its annual fundraising gala. Politicians, business leaders, wealthy donors, and media personalities would all attend. The event represented one of the most important nights on the church calendar. As I studied the invitation package sent to major donors, an idea began forming in my mind. For 23 years, I had searched for answers. For 23 years, I had wondered whether my parents remembered the son they left behind. Suddenly, I realized I no longer needed to wonder. I could ask them myself, not through lawyers, not through investigators, face to face. I declined interviews, postponed meetings, and cleared my schedule. Then I booked a flight to Atlanta. The city looked different when my plane landed, but the memories returned immediately. The streets, the neighborhoods, the skyline. Every mile carried fragments of a life that had been stolen from me. On the night of the gala, I stood alone inside a luxury hotel suite overlooking downtown Atlanta. A tailored black tuxedo hung from the closet door. My invitation rested on the table beside a gold-embossed program listing the evening's speakers. At the very top of the schedule appeared a familiar name: Pastor Calvin Sterling. I picked up the invitation and stared at it for several seconds. 23 years had passed since the last time I saw my parents walk through a pair of doors without looking back. Tonight, I would finally see them again, and they would have absolutely no idea who had just walked into their world. they would have absolutely no idea who had just walked into their world. The ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel looked exactly the way powerful people wanted the world to see them. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Servers moved silently between tables carrying expensive wine and carefully prepared meals. Politicians laughed beside business executives. Television reporters interviewed major donors near the entrance. Every detail had been designed to communicate wealth, influence, and success. As I stepped through the doors, nobody paid much attention to me. That was exactly how I wanted it. I wasn't there to be noticed. Not yet. I spent the first 30 minutes observing. Years in finance had taught me that people reveal far more when they believe nobody is watching. Across the room, I finally saw them. Calvin Sterling looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned gray, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he still carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to admiration. Patricia stood beside him wearing an elegant designer dress while greeting guests with the same warm smile she once used before abandoning her son at a bus station. For a moment, I simply stared. 23 years. 23 years of questions, anger, loneliness, and determination had led to this room. I expected rage. I expected hatred. Instead, I felt strangely calm. They looked like strangers. Whatever connection once existed between us had died a long time ago. A loud voice pulled my attention toward the stage. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and thanked them for supporting Greater Light Ministries. Applause filled the ballroom. One speaker followed another. Local politicians praised the church's community outreach programs. Business leaders discussed charitable partnerships. Several families shared emotional stories about how the ministry had changed their lives. Throughout it all, Calvin Sterling remained the star attraction. People lined up simply to shake his hand. They treated him like a man of extraordinary character. If only they knew. Halfway through the evening, Calvin stepped onto the stage to deliver the keynote address. The room immediately fell silent. He spoke with the same charisma I remembered from childhood. He talked about sacrifice, responsibility, and faith. He spoke about family values. He spoke about protecting children. Every sentence felt almost surreal. The irony was so overwhelming that I nearly laughed out loud. At one point, he received a standing ovation. Hundreds of people rose to their feet, applauding a man who had abandoned his 9-year-old son without looking back. When the applause finally settled, the fundraising portion of the evening began. Large screens illuminated around the ballroom, displaying various ministry projects. The organizers announced scholarship programs, youth initiatives, housing assistance efforts, and community expansion plans. Then came the centerpiece of the night. A symbolic gold-plated commemorative brick representing the future expansion of the ministry's education center. The item itself wasn't particularly valuable. Its importance was entirely symbolic. Wealthy donors would compete for the honor of sponsoring the project. The auctioneer stepped onto the stage and immediately energized the room. Bidding started at $50,000. Several hands went up. Within seconds, the price doubled, then doubled again. The audience enjoyed the spectacle. Wealthy people often treat charity auctions as social competitions disguised as generosity. $100,000 became $200,000. $200,000 became $500,000. Eventually, the bidding slowed. The final two participants pushed the number to $750,000 before one finally surrendered. The room applauded. The auctioneer smiled broadly. "Do I hear 800,000?" Silence. 800,000? Nothing. The auctioneer prepared to close the bidding. Then I raised my paddle. $5 million. For a moment, nobody reacted. The number was so far beyond expectations that several people assumed they had heard incorrectly. The auctioneer blinked. A woman near the stage actually dropped her champagne glass. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head in the ballroom turned toward me. "I'm sorry, sir," the auctioneer said. "Did you say 500,000? "No," I replied calmly. "I said $5 million. The silence that followed felt almost physical. $5 million wasn't simply a winning bid. It was a declaration. It transformed a routine charity auction into the defining moment of the evening. Reporters immediately began whispering to each other. Cameras turned in my direction. Several donors stared as though I had lost my mind. Then the room erupted into applause. The auctioneer practically shouted his excitement while confirming the bid multiple times. Nobody challenged it. Nobody could. Within seconds, I had become the most important person in the ballroom, exactly as planned. On stage, Calvin Sterling looked stunned. So did Patricia. Neither recognized me, but both clearly wanted to meet the mysterious donor who had just transformed their fundraising goals. The auctioneer officially closed the sale and invited me to stand. I rose slowly from my chair. Hundreds of eyes followed me. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. Calvin stepped forward and thanked me publicly for my extraordinary generosity. Then he did something I had anticipated from the beginning. He invited me to join him on stage. The crowd applauded again as I walked toward the platform. Every step felt strangely familiar, as though fate had been rehearsing this moment for years. When I reached the stage, Calvin extended his hand. I shook it. The man who abandoned me had no idea he was touching his son for the first time in 23 years. "Sir," he said into the microphone, "on behalf of Greater Light Ministries, thank you. Your generosity will change countless lives." The audience applauded once more. I smiled politely. "I'm honored to contribute." My voice caused Patricia to look at me more carefully. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed her face. Not recognition. Not yet. Just uncertainty. Something about me felt familiar to her. Calvin continued speaking, unaware of the storm quietly approaching his life. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced proudly, "this remarkable donor represents the very best of our community. More applause, more cameras, more admiration. The perfect moment, the exact moment I had spent months preparing for. As the audience celebrated, I reached into my pocket and touched an old folded $10 bill I had carried for more than 2 decades. The same bill my mother had given me before walking away forever. The paper felt worn beneath my fingers. Suddenly, 23 years disappeared. I was 9 years old again, sitting alone on a plastic bench waiting for parents who never returned. Except this time, I wasn't the abandoned child. This time, I was the most powerful man in the room. And in just a few minutes, Calvin and Patricia Sterling were about to discover exactly who had paid $5 million for their attention. And in just a few minutes, Calvin and Patricia Sterling were about to discover exactly who had paid $5 million for their attention. The applause continued long after I returned to my seat. Reporters rushed across the ballroom searching for information about the mysterious donor who had suddenly become the highlight of the evening. Wealthy guests whispered to one another while trying to place my face. A few recognized me from business magazines and financial news interviews, but most simply knew I was rich enough to casually spend $5 million on a symbolic charity auction item. That alone was enough to make me the most popular person in the room. I barely touched the expensive dinner placed in front of me. My attention remained fixed on the stage. Calvin was smiling again. Patricia was smiling again. The entire Sterling family was celebrating what they believed had been the most successful fundraiser in church history. None of them realized the night had only just begun. Less than 10 minutes later, a young event coordinator approached my table. "Mr. Sterling," she said politely, "Pastor Sterling would love to personally thank you in the private reception lounge." The irony nearly made me laugh. Pastor Sterling wanted to thank Sterling. If only he knew. "Of course," I replied. "Lead the way." The reception lounge occupied a private section of the hotel behind the ballroom. Security guards monitored the entrance while selected donors and VIP guests gathered inside. The atmosphere felt far more intimate than the main event. As I entered, several influential business leaders immediately approached to introduce themselves. I shook hands, exchanged polite conversation, and answered a few questions. Then the crowd suddenly parted. Calvin Sterling was walking directly toward me. Patricia followed only a few steps behind. Both wore the excited expressions of people who believed they had just met an important ally. "Mr. Sterling," Calvin said warmly while extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally. What you did tonight was extraordinary." I shook his hand again. "You're welcome." $5 million, Patricia added with a smile. "That's one of the most generous donations we've ever received." I noticed something strange happening as she studied my face. The longer she looked, the more uncomfortable she seemed. It wasn't recognition. Not yet. It was something deeper. Some buried instinct was trying to warn her that she had seen me before. Calvin continued speaking enthusiastically about future ministry projects. I listened patiently. 23 years ago, I would have done almost anything to hear my father talk to me for 5 uninterrupted minutes. Now I could barely tolerate listening to him. Every compliment felt hollow. Every expression of gratitude felt dishonest. He was thanking me because he believed I was useful. Nothing more. "We'd love to learn more about you," he said. "Successful people who support our mission are always welcome here." I smiled slightly. "Really?" "Absolutely. Family is important to you?" Calvin nodded immediately. "It's one of the foundations of everything we believe," Patricia agreed. "Family is God's greatest gift." For a brief moment, silence settled over the conversation. The hypocrisy was almost unbearable. I watched both of them carefully. Neither showed the slightest sign of guilt. Neither appeared haunted by their decision. Neither carried the weight of abandoning a child. They had moved on with their lives years ago. To them, I was simply another wealthy donor. The realization hurt far more than I expected. I had spent decades imagining this moment. Deep down, part of me believed they would recognize me instantly. Part of me believed regret would appear on their faces. Instead, nothing happened. They had forgotten me so completely that they couldn't recognize their own son standing 3 feet away. Then another voice interrupted the conversation. "Dad, are you introducing our mystery billionaire without me?" I turned and saw a woman approaching with confident strides. She looked exactly like the photographs from the investigator's report. Chloe Sterling, my sister, the daughter who had received everything I lost. She wore a designer gown worth more than most people earned in a month, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Beside her walked a tall man with an expensive watch and an even more expensive smile. Jamal Richardson, her husband, the real estate developer drowning in hidden debt. "Chloe," Calvin said proudly, "this is Mr. Isaiah Sterling." The moment my name left his mouth, the entire world seemed to freeze. Patricia's smile disappeared first, then Chloe's, then Calvin's. Nobody spoke, nobody moved, their eyes locked onto me. I could almost see memories struggling to resurface. Isaiah, Sterling, the abandoned son, the forgotten child, the boy from the bus station. Recognition arrived slowly, then all at once. Patricia staggered backward. One hand flew to her mouth. Calvin's face drained of color. Chloe stared as if she had seen a ghost. "No," Patricia whispered. "No. That's impossible." For 23 years, I had imagined what this moment would feel like. I expected satisfaction. I expected anger. Instead, I felt calm, almost cold. "Hello, Mom," I said quietly. "Hello, Dad." Nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. The noise from the ballroom seemed to disappear entirely. Calvin looked older within seconds. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. Real tears. Unfortunately for her, they arrived 23 years too late. "Isaiah," she whispered, "it really is you?" "The last time you saw me," I replied, "I was sitting alone in a Greyhound station." The words hit them like a physical blow. Chloe looked completely lost. She had obviously heard some version of the story growing up, but not the truth. Not the full truth. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, sensing danger without understanding it. Calvin finally found his voice. "Son, don't." My response stopped him instantly. "You lost the right to call me that a very long time ago." Another painful silence followed. Then I slowly reached into my pocket. For years, I had carried a single object everywhere I went. Through foster homes, through college, through every business success and every failure. I unfolded the worn piece of paper and placed it gently on the table between us. Patricia gasped. Calvin looked as though he had been punched. It was the $10 bill, the same bill she had handed me before abandoning me. I had preserved it for 23 years. "You remember this?" I asked softly. Neither answered. They didn't have to. Their faces said everything. "I spent $2 on a soda," I continued. "Another dollar on chips. I kept the rest because I thought maybe you'd come back for me." Patricia began crying openly. Calvin stared at the bill without blinking. "Isaiah," he said, "we can explain." I smiled. Not because anything was funny, because I had waited 23 years to hear those words. "Good," I said. Because I came all the way back to Atlanta to hear exactly what kind of explanation could possibly justify what you did. And for the first time that night, the Sterling family realized the $5 million had never been a donation. It had been an invitation to a reckoning they could no longer avoid. And for the first time that night, the Sterling family realized the $5 million had never been a donation. It had been an invitation to a reckoning they could no longer avoid. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The private reception lounge felt frozen in time. Calvin stared at the $10 bill lying on the table as if it were evidence from a crime scene. Patricia continued crying quietly. Chloe looked back and forth between her parents and me, trying to understand what was happening. Jamal, meanwhile, watched everyone carefully. Unlike the others, he wasn't focused on the emotional shock. He was calculating. I recognized the look immediately. I had spent decades negotiating with investors, executives, and opportunists. Jamal was assessing value. He was trying to determine exactly how useful I might be. Isaiah, Patricia finally whispered, we searched for you. It was the first explanation they offered. It lasted less than 3 seconds before collapsing. No, you didn't, I replied calmly. If you had searched for me, you would have found me. Another silence followed, because everyone in the room knew I was right. My interviews had appeared on national television. My company had been featured in major financial publications. My name existed everywhere. The truth was obvious. They hadn't searched. Not seriously. Not for very long. Calvin rubbed his forehead and exhaled heavily. We made mistakes. Mistakes? I repeated. Forgetting someone's birthday is a mistake. Missing a meeting is a mistake. Leaving a 9-year-old child at a bus station is a decision. Patricia began crying harder. 23 years ago, those tears might have mattered to me. Now they felt strangely irrelevant. The person most affected by their choices had already survived the consequences. Jamal suddenly stepped forward. Maybe we should all sit down, he suggested. We're family. We can talk this through. Family. The word almost made me laugh. Nobody had used that word when I spent years moving through foster homes. Nobody used that word when birthdays passed without a phone call. Now that a billionaire had appeared, suddenly everyone wanted to talk about family. We moved toward a private seating area. Calvin and Patricia sat together. Chloe sat beside her mother. Jamal positioned himself directly across from me. It was subtle, but intentional. He wanted the best angle to study me. The next hour became a strange mixture of excuses, half-truths, and carefully selected memories. Calvin claimed financial hardship had pushed them into impossible circumstances. Patricia claimed emotional stress had clouded their judgment. Both insisted they regretted what happened, yet neither provided an actual explanation. Every answer seemed designed to avoid the central question. Why had they abandoned me? Not temporarily, not accidentally, permanently. At one point, I noticed Jamal typing something into his phone beneath the table. Most people wouldn't have paid attention. I did. Years in business had trained me to notice details. He wasn't texting. He was searching. Every few minutes his eyes widened slightly before returning to the screen. Then he looked at me differently. Not with curiosity, not with guilt, with interest. A dangerous kind of interest. Eventually he cleared his throat. Sterling Capital Group, he said casually. That's quite an accomplishment. The room changed instantly. Until that moment, the conversation had focused on the past. Now it shifted toward money. I've been fortunate, I replied. Fortunate? Jamal laughed softly. Your company manages billions. Patricia looked surprised. Chloe looked shocked. Calvin looked confused. They clearly knew I was successful, but none of them understood the scale. Jamal understood. He had already researched enough to know exactly who was sitting across from him. The conversation gradually transformed. Questions about my childhood disappeared. Questions about my business appeared. How many offices did we have? What industries did we invest in? What projects interested us? How large was the company? The transition was so obvious it almost felt insulting. 23 years of absence suddenly became less important than my balance sheet. Chloe became particularly interested after learning several details about my investments. You've done incredibly well for yourself, she said. I'm proud of you. Proud. Another interesting word. She had never met me before tonight. She knew nothing about the years I spent surviving foster care, nothing about the sacrifices, nothing about the loneliness. Yet somehow she felt entitled to be proud. "Thank you," I replied politely. Across the table, Jamal's mind was moving faster than everyone else's. I could practically see the gears turning. The man was drowning in debt. My investigators had already shown me enough financial records to understand the situation. Several development projects were over-leveraged. Multiple loans approached dangerous territory. Cash flow problems existed beneath the surface. To most people, Jamal looked successful. To me, he looked desperate. And desperate people often make predictable decisions. "You know," Jamal said eventually, "it's amazing how life works. Families can reconnect after years apart." There it was, the opening move. Not a request. Not yet. Just a test. A way to see how receptive I might be. I smiled without answering. Jamal continued. "There's a lot of potential here. New relationships, new opportunities, new beginnings." The more he spoke, the more convinced I became that money interested him far more than reconciliation. The same realization appeared to be spreading through the room. Patricia wanted forgiveness. Calvin wanted redemption. Chloe wanted status. Jamal wanted access. Everyone wanted something. Nobody seemed particularly interested in what I wanted. Near the end of the evening, Jamal made his move. "Why don't we have dinner tomorrow night?" he suggested enthusiastically. "Just family. No reporters. No church members. No distractions." Chloe immediately supported the idea. Patricia looked hopeful. Calvin nodded in agreement. "I'd like that," he said. "We have a lot to discuss." I considered the proposal for several seconds. The truth was that I already planned to continue the conversation. Not because I wanted a relationship, because I wanted information. The Sterling family represented a mystery I had been trying to solve for more than 2 decades. Every interaction revealed something new. Every conversation exposed another weakness. Every excuse uncovered another lie. "All right," I said finally. Relief spread across their faces. Patricia actually smiled. Calvin looked grateful. Chloe looked excited. Jamal looked victorious. They misunderstood my answer completely. To them, dinner represented healing. To me, it represented research. As the evening ended, we exchanged contact information and prepared to leave. Jamal shook my hand firmly. "This is the beginning of something great," he said. "I can feel it." I smiled. "Maybe." He interpreted that as optimism. It wasn't. On the drive back to my hotel, I sat quietly in the rear seat of a black SUV while Atlanta's lights passed outside the window. My phone buzzed with a message from Xavier Monroe, the lead investigator I had hired nearly a year earlier. Attached were several updated reports regarding the Sterling family, new financial information, new business records, new details. I opened the first file and began reading. By the time I reached the hotel, one thing had become crystal clear. Jamal Richardson believed he had just discovered the family's salvation. What he didn't know was that I had already spent months investigating every member of the Sterling family. And the deeper I looked, the more secrets I found. And the deeper I looked, the more secrets I found. The following evening, I arrived at the Richardson residence precisely at 7 o'clock. The house sat inside one of Atlanta's most exclusive gated communities. Expensive landscaping surrounded a property large enough to impress almost anyone. To most visitors, it looked like success. To me, it looked like debt. Wealth and financial strength are not the same thing. Some of the richest-looking people in America are only a few bad decisions away from disaster. As I stepped through the front door, I immediately noticed the effort everyone had made. Patricia personally greeted me. Calvin offered a handshake that felt awkward and uncertain. Chloe had organized an elaborate dinner. Even Jamal appeared unusually attentive. The entire evening carried the atmosphere of people desperately trying to create a family memory that should have existed 23 years earlier. Unfortunately, some opportunities expire forever. "You look good, son," Calvin said as we moved toward the dining room. I stopped walking. The single word instantly changed the atmosphere. Son. The room became quiet. Calvin immediately realized his mistake. "Isaiah," he corrected softly. "You look good." I nodded and continued walking. Nobody mentioned the moment again, yet everyone felt it. During dinner, conversation remained carefully controlled. Nobody wanted conflict. Nobody wanted uncomfortable questions. Instead, they talked about safe topics: business, travel, charity work, Atlanta real estate, current events. It felt less like a family reunion and more like strangers attempting to negotiate a fragile peace agreement. I mostly listened. Listening reveals far more than talking. The longer the evening continued, the more patterns I noticed. Patricia watched me constantly. Not in a manipulative way. More like someone afraid I might disappear if she looked away. Calvin seemed nervous every time the conversation approached the past. Chloe worked hard to maintain a positive atmosphere. Jamal, however, interested me most. He asked intelligent questions. Not about childhood, not about family, about business, investments, markets, capital allocation. The subjects themselves weren't suspicious. The frequency was. Sterling Capital has had impressive growth, Jamal said while pouring wine, especially over the last decade. We've been fortunate. He smiled. Success at that scale usually isn't luck. There it was again, the subtle probing. The careful attempt to understand exactly how much influence I possessed. To most people, the exchange would have sounded harmless. To me, it sounded like research. Halfway through dinner, Chloe excused herself to answer a phone call. A few minutes later, she returned, looking concerned. Everything okay? Patricia asked. Just a scheduling issue, Chloe replied quickly. The answer sounded rehearsed. Jamal immediately changed the subject, too quickly. Another detail worth remembering. After dinner, we moved into a sitting area overlooking the backyard. The conversation became more personal. For the first time, childhood memories entered the discussion. Not mine, theirs. Calvin talked about church growth. Patricia discussed community programs. Chloe shared stories about family vacations. Every story carried the same uncomfortable implication. Life had continued. Birthdays, holidays, graduations, celebrations. Decades of memories existed without me. Nobody intended to hurt me by sharing them. Somehow, that made it worse. Around 9 o'clock, Patricia finally gathered enough courage to ask the question she had clearly been carrying all evening. Were you happy? The room immediately became silent. Everyone understood the weight behind those 3 words. She wasn't asking about my current life. She was asking about the 23 years she missed. I considered the question carefully before answering. Sometimes. Tears appeared in her eyes immediately. And the rest of the time? The rest of the time, I learned how to survive. Nobody spoke after that. There wasn't much to say. The truth rarely requires lengthy explanations. Later, while the others became distracted by conversation, I stepped onto the patio for fresh air. The night was quiet, warm, peaceful. Then I heard voices. Not inside the house. Near the far side of the property. Instinctively, I moved closer. Years in business had taught me to recognize private conversations. Jamal was speaking on the phone. His voice sounded completely different from the confident version he presented inside. I need more time, he said sharply. Silence followed. Then another response from the other end. I understand the agreement. More silence. 30 days isn't enough. I stopped moving. Every instinct immediately activated. Jamal wasn't discussing a normal business matter. He was negotiating from a position of weakness. A dangerous position. Several seconds later, he ended the call and remained standing alone. Even from a distance, I could see tension in his posture. Fear. Real fear. Then his phone rang again. This time, he looked at the screen and visibly flinched before rejecting the call. Interesting. Very interesting. I quietly returned inside before he noticed me. A few minutes later, Jamal rejoined the group wearing the same confident smile as before. Nobody else seemed to notice the difference. I did. Desperation leaves fingerprints. Near the end of the evening, Calvin invited me into his private study. The room contained shelves filled with books, photographs, and awards collected over decades. Several family portraits decorated the walls. Every image told the same story. A respected pastor, a loving wife, a successful daughter, a strong family. Looking at those photographs felt surreal. Not because I wasn't included, because they had spent 23 years pretending I never existed. I know you don't trust us, Calvin said quietly after closing the door. Can you blame me? He lowered his eyes. No. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Calvin surprised me. There's something you should know. My attention sharpened immediately. What? He looked toward one of the family photographs before answering. The story you've been told about your disappearance isn't complete. Every alarm inside my head activated. What story? The one we've told everyone, including ourselves. The room suddenly felt smaller. What aren't you telling me? Calvin opened his mouth, then stopped. Fear crossed his face. Genuine fear. Not guilt, not shame. Fear. Not tonight, he said finally. Frustration surged through me. Then why bring it up? Calvin looked exhausted. Because sooner or later you're going to discover the truth. Those words followed me all the way back to the hotel. Around midnight, I received another message from Xavier Monroe. Attached was a newly completed background report. Most of the information focused on family financial structures, property holdings, business relationships, and historical records connected to the Sterling family. I opened the file expecting routine updates. Instead, one section immediately caught my attention. Buried inside several legal documents was my name. Not once, multiple times. The references were old, decades old. And according to Xavier's notes, they appeared inside records that should never have included me at all. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I picked up the phone and called him immediately. Because for the first time since returning to Atlanta, I had evidence that my abandonment wasn't simply a family tragedy. It was connected to something much bigger. Because for the first time since returning to Atlanta, I had evidence that my abandonment wasn't simply a family tragedy. It was connected to something much bigger. Xavier answered on the second ring. I figured you'd call. Start talking. I could hear papers moving on the other end of the line. The records are legitimate. We verified them twice. Why is my name inside those documents? That's the interesting part. My pulse accelerated. Xavier continued. The references appear in trust-related filings, beneficiary reviews, and legal memorandums created shortly before your disappearance. I sat down slowly on the edge of the hotel bed. Trusts? Yes. What kind of trusts? Family trusts. Silence filled the room. For several seconds, I simply stared at the city lights outside my window. Nothing about this made sense. My parents weren't wealthy when I was a child. At least not wealthy enough to justify complicated trust structures. Yet somehow my name appeared repeatedly inside legal documents connected to family assets. How much are we talking about? I asked. We don't know yet. Find out. Already working on it. I barely slept that night. Every question led to 3 more. Every answer created new confusion. By sunrise, one fact had become impossible to ignore. Calvin knew something. His behavior at dinner proved it. The fear in his eyes hadn't been the fear of a guilty parent. It had been the fear of someone watching an old secret slowly surface. The following afternoon, I met Xavier in person. He had rented a temporary office near downtown Atlanta specifically for the investigation. The walls were covered with timelines, property records, family trees, business structures, and legal notes. Looking around the room felt like stepping inside a criminal investigation. In some ways, that's exactly what it had become. Show me everything. Xavier handed me a thick folder. For the next hour, we reviewed records together. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Calvin Sterling, Patricia Sterling, various attorneys, several family trusts. Then another name surfaced over and over again. Eleanor Whitmore. Who is she? I asked. Xavier checked his notes. Your great-aunt. I frowned. I've never heard of her. Most people haven't. That answer immediately interested me. Forgotten relatives rarely appear in major legal documents unless they matter. According to the records, Eleanor had been heavily involved in family financial matters during the years surrounding my disappearance. Then her name gradually vanished, almost as if someone intentionally removed her from future decisions. Still alive? I asked. Xavier shook his head. Passed away several years ago. Another dead end. Or so I thought. Then he handed me a photocopy of a legal memorandum. One paragraph had been highlighted. I read it twice before looking up. This can't be right. We verified it. The memorandum referenced potential future claims involving direct descendants. My name appeared specifically, not as a beneficiary, not as an owner, as a consideration, a complication, a factor. In other words, my existence mattered to people making decisions behind closed doors. Are you telling me they abandoned me because of money? Xavier leaned back in his chair. I'm telling you, money appears somewhere in the story. The distinction mattered. Too many people jump to conclusions when money enters a conversation. I preferred evidence. Evidence was harder to manipulate. Later that evening, Calvin invited me to attend a Sunday service at Greater Light Ministries. Under normal circumstances, I would have declined. Instead, curiosity won. If answers existed, they likely existed somewhere inside the world my father had built. Sunday morning arrived with thousands of people filling the church campus. The scale surprised even me. Multiple buildings occupied the property. Volunteers directed traffic. Families moved between services. Children participated in youth programs. To outsiders, the place looked less like a church and more like an institution. Calvin's institution. As I walked through the crowd, something became immediately obvious. People adored him. Everywhere he went, members greeted him with admiration and affection. They thanked him for changing their lives. They praised his leadership. They trusted him completely. Watching it unfold felt surreal. These people saw a spiritual leader. I saw a man who once left a 9-year-old child at a bus station and never came back. During the service, Calvin delivered a sermon about forgiveness. The irony was almost unbearable. Several times I caught him glancing toward me, not proudly, not nervously, almost cautiously, like a man waiting for a storm he knew was coming. After the service ended, I remained behind while members gradually left the sanctuary. That's when something unexpected happened. An elderly woman approached me. She moved slowly with the help of a cane. "You're Isaiah," she said quietly. I froze. "How do you know that?" Her eyes softened. "Because you look exactly like your grandfather." Every instinct inside me activated. "Did you know my family?" She nodded. "A long time ago." Before I could ask another question, she glanced toward Calvin's office and lowered her voice. "Some people never wanted you to disappear." My heart started pounding. "What does that mean?" The woman hesitated. "Ask about Eleanor." Then she turned and slowly walked away. I stood there for several seconds, stunned. Eleanor again. The same name from the trust records. The same name connected to legal disputes before my abandonment. The same name nobody in my family had ever mentioned. Coincidence was becoming increasingly difficult to believe. That evening, I returned to the hotel and immediately called Xavier. "We need everything on Eleanor Whitmore." "What happened?" "I think she's the key." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Xavier sighed. "Good." "Why good?" "Because another report came in this afternoon." My pulse accelerated again. "And?" "Eleanor wasn't just involved." He paused. "She objected." I sat upright instantly. Objected to what? Silence. Then Xavier delivered the sentence that changed the entire investigation. "According to newly recovered correspondence, Eleanor fought against a decision being made about you shortly before you disappeared." Every muscle in my body tightened. For 23 years, I believed nobody had stood up for me. Nobody had objected. Nobody had cared enough to stop what happened. Now, for the first time, evidence suggested otherwise. Somewhere in the past, someone had tried to protect me. And if Eleanor fought against the decision, then somebody else fought for it. The question was no longer why I had been abandoned. The question was who had benefited from it. The question was no longer why I had been abandoned. The question was who had benefited from it. I spent most of the night staring at documents spread across the desk in my hotel suite. For 23 years, I had believed my story was simple. Parents abandon child. Child survives. End of story. Now the situation looked far more complicated. Trust records, legal memorandums, hidden correspondence, Eleanor Whitmore. Every new discovery suggested that my disappearance had affected more than just a family. It had affected decisions, financial decisions, legal decisions, decisions important enough to remain hidden for more than 2 decades. By sunrise, I had reached a conclusion. It was time to stop chasing documents and start confronting people. The first person on that list was Calvin Sterling. I called him shortly after 8 o'clock. "We need to talk." He immediately recognized something in my voice. About what? You already know. Silence followed. Not confusion, not surprise. Silence. Come to my office, he said quietly. 10 o'clock. I arrived exactly on time. The church campus looked far different on a weekday. Most buildings sat quiet. Parking lots remained half empty. Volunteers moved through offices carrying paperwork and supplies. The peaceful atmosphere contrasted sharply with the storm building inside my head. Calvin was waiting when I entered. For several moments, neither of us spoke. He looked tired. Older than he had only days earlier. Almost as if the weight of the past had finally become visible. You found something. It wasn't a question. Yes. I placed copies of the trust references on his desk. Then I added notes regarding Eleanor Whitmore. Finally, I slid forward the memorandum containing my name. Calvin stared at the documents for several seconds before closing his eyes. That reaction told me everything. He recognized them. How much do you know? He asked. Not enough. Maybe that's a good thing. I laughed bitterly. You don't get to decide that anymore. The room became quiet. Calvin slowly lowered himself into his chair. For the first time since our reunion, he looked less like a pastor and more like a frightened old man. The situation was complicated. There it was, the sentence every guilty person eventually uses. Complicated how? There were family issues. What issues? Financial concerns. Whose concerns? Every answer created another question. Every explanation remained vague. Eventually, frustration overcame patience. Stop talking like a lawyer. My voice echoed through the office. I'm your son. Tell me the truth. Calvin looked away. I don't know if I can. Then let me help. I leaned forward. Did money play a role? He hesitated. Yes. Did family trust play a role? Another hesitation. Yes. Did Eleanor oppose what happened? This time the reaction was immediate. Calvin's face tightened. His eyes dropped toward the desk. Another answer. She did. My pulse accelerated. Finally, something concrete. Why? I asked. Because she believed we were making a mistake. Were you? Calvin laughed softly. The sound carried no humor, only regret. Every day of my life. For a moment, genuine sadness crossed his face. The problem was that regret, 23 years later, doesn't erase 23 years of damage. Who pushed for it? I asked. The question changed everything. Calvin immediately became guarded. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. Silence. Who wanted me gone? His hands tightened around the edge of the desk. It wasn't like that. Then explain it. He couldn't, or wouldn't. Both possibilities bothered me. Several long seconds passed before he finally spoke. Your mother was scared. The statement landed heavily. Scared of what? Losing everything. Everything? I repeated. What exactly is everything? Calvin rubbed his forehead. You don't understand the pressure we were under. There it was again. Pressure. Another vague explanation. Another attempt to avoid specifics. Yet one detail stood out. Patricia. For the first time, Calvin had pointed directly toward her. Not as the villain. Not as the mastermind. But as someone deeply involved. Before I could continue, a knock interrupted the conversation. The office door opened and Patricia stepped inside. The moment she saw the documents spread across Calvin's desk, all color disappeared from her face. She knew exactly what we were discussing. Isaiah. Her voice sounded fragile. What are you doing here? I asked. She ignored the question and stared at Calvin. You promised. Interesting. Very interesting. Calvin looked uncomfortable. He was going to find out eventually. Patricia's breathing became uneven. Fear. Real fear. Not guilt. Not sadness. Fear. Find out what? I asked quietly. Neither answered. The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Then Patricia surprised both of us. Not here. Calvin looked shocked. So did I. What? Patricia swallowed hard. If we're going to talk, we're doing it somewhere private. Her reaction told me more than any document. Whatever secret they were hiding, they feared exposure even now. 23 years later, after several moments, Patricia turned toward me. Tomorrow. Tomorrow what? I'll answer your questions. I studied her carefully. She wasn't bluffing. She looked exhausted, cornered, like someone who had spent decades carrying a burden she could no longer hold. Everything? I asked. She closed her eyes briefly. Everything I can. That wasn't a full promise, but it was more honesty than I had received so far. Later that afternoon, I met Xavier and updated him on the conversation. He listened carefully before leaning back in his chair. Patricia's cracking. You think so? Absolutely. He pointed toward the timeline covering one wall. Look at the pattern. Calvin avoids. Patricia reacts. The distinction mattered. One hid information. The other feared information. Those aren't the same thing. Then Xavier handed me another newly recovered document. The file came from an attorney involved with the family decades earlier. Most of it contained routine legal language. Then I noticed a handwritten note attached to the final page. 4 simple words. Protect Patricia at all costs. I stared at the note for several seconds. What the hell does that mean? Xavier slowly shook his head. I think we're finally asking the right question. That night, for the first time since returning to Atlanta, I stopped wondering what happened to me. Instead, I started wondering what happened to Patricia, because every trail I followed seemed to lead back to the same place: the trust, Eleanor Whitmore, my abandonment, and whatever secret my mother had spent 23 years desperately trying to keep buried. And whatever secret my mother had spent 23 years desperately trying to keep buried. The following day moved slower than any day I could remember. Waiting has a strange way of magnifying time. Every hour felt longer than it should have. Every minute created new questions. By noon, I had already reviewed Eleanor's files 3 separate times, hoping some overlooked detail might reveal what Patricia was hiding. Nothing did. The answers remained locked inside people, not documents. Shortly after 3 o'clock, Patricia finally called. Her voice sounded exhausted. Can you meet me alone? That immediately caught my attention. Where? She gave me the name of a small cafe on the outskirts of Atlanta. Not a luxury restaurant, not a church office, not a family home. Neutral ground. I'll be there. When I arrived, Patricia was already waiting. She sat alone near a corner window with a cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched. The moment I saw her, I noticed how different she looked. For the first time since our reunion, she wasn't dressed like the wife of a famous pastor. She looked like an ordinary woman carrying decades of regret. Deep lines surrounded her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly. Even her posture seemed smaller, more fragile. I sat across from her. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, Patricia broke the silence. I used to imagine this conversation. For 23 years? She nodded slowly. More times than I can count. I studied her carefully. Then let's stop imagining and start talking. Patricia lowered her eyes. Fair enough. Several moments passed before she finally spoke again. Your father told you about the trust. Some of it. Not enough. Then tell me the rest. She looked toward the window. The trust wasn't the problem. That answer immediately surprised me. Then why does my name appear in the records? Because you mattered. How? Patricia closed her eyes briefly. That's the question everyone was arguing about. My pulse accelerated. For weeks, trust documents had pointed toward financial motives. Now Patricia was suggesting something different. Who was arguing? Family members, advisors, attorneys. About what? She hesitated. Your future. I leaned forward. You left me at a bus station. My voice remained calm, but barely. Don't pretend my future suddenly mattered. The words hit hard. Patricia visibly flinched. You're right. Another silence followed. Then she surprised me. Eleanor hated what happened. There was that name again, Eleanor Whitmore, the ghost hiding inside every important document. Why? I asked. Patricia stared into her untouched coffee. Because she believed we crossed a line we could never uncross. Did you? Tears appeared in her eyes. Every single day. For a brief moment, I almost felt sympathy. Then I remembered a frightened 9-year-old boy sitting alone in a Greyhound station holding a $10 bill. Sympathy disappeared. Who made the decision? I asked. Patricia immediately looked away. Not confusion. Not uncertainty. Avoidance. It wasn't one person. That's not what I asked. Isaiah. Who? Her breathing became uneven. The fear returned. The same fear I had seen inside Calvin's office. The same fear Xavier had noticed. The same fear hidden beneath every conversation. Your father wasn't strong enough to stop it. The answer landed heavily. And you? Tears rolled down her cheeks. I convinced myself it was temporary. I stared at her in disbelief. Temporary? That's what I told myself. For 23 years? Patricia broke completely. She covered her face with both hands and began crying. Not politely. Not dramatically. The kind of crying that comes from carrying unbearable guilt for far too long. People at nearby tables glanced toward us before looking away again. For several minutes, she couldn't speak. When she finally regained control, her voice sounded hollow. I kept waiting for the right time to fix it. And? The longer I waited, the harder it became. I didn't respond, because that explanation, while pathetic, also sounded terrifyingly human. Small failures become larger failures, then larger failures become permanent disasters. Then people spend decades pretending they had no choice. What aren't you telling me? I asked quietly. Patricia froze. There it was. The question neither of us could avoid any longer. What do you mean? Every time Eleanor appears, you panic. Every time the trust appears, you panic. Every time the past comes up, you panic. I leaned forward. You're still hiding something. The color drained from her face. Complete silence followed. Then, for the first time, she admitted it. Yes. My heart immediately started pounding. What? Patricia looked around the cafe nervously before lowering her voice. There were things happening back then that had nothing to do with money. Every instinct inside me activated. Such as? She opened her mouth, then stopped. Fear flooded her expression. Real fear. Stronger than anything I had seen before. Patricia. She shook her head. I can't. Why? Because I don't know who still knows. The answer sent chills down my spine. Who knows what? She stared directly into my eyes. The truth. Before I could ask another question, her phone rang. Patricia looked at the screen and immediately went pale. The reaction was instant. Pure panic. She rejected the call. Seconds later it rang again. The same number. Then again. Who's calling? I asked. Patricia stood up abruptly. I have to go. Not this time. Isaiah. No, not this time. She looked torn between fear and desperation. Then she reached into her purse and removed an old photograph. Without a word, she placed it on the table. I looked down. The image showed a younger version of myself standing beside an elderly woman, Eleanor Whitmore. Written on the back were 4 words. She tried to stop it. Before I could react, Patricia turned and hurried toward the exit. Patricia! She stopped only once, just long enough to look back. Tears filled her eyes. Find Eleanor's records, she whispered. They'll tell you what really happened. Then she disappeared into the afternoon crowd. I remained seated for several moments, staring at the photograph. My pulse hammered inside my chest. The trust wasn't the answer. Money wasn't the answer. According to Patricia, something else existed beneath everything. Something powerful enough to terrify her even now. That evening, Xavier called with another update. The moment I answered, I knew something had changed. We found Eleanor. She's dead. Not her. Xavier paused. Her records. I sat upright instantly. What did you find? Silence. Then 3 words that changed everything. You need proof. You need proof. Those 3 words stayed with me during the entire drive to Xavier's office. For weeks, every discovery had raised new questions. Trust records. Eleanor Whitmore. Patricia's fear. Calvin's silence. Each clue pointed toward something larger, yet nothing connected completely. Now, for the first time, Xavier sounded confident. Not curious. Not speculative. Confident. By the time I arrived, he was already waiting. Several folders covered the conference table. A projector illuminated one wall. Unlike previous meetings, everything appeared organized into a single timeline. For the first time, the investigation looked less like a collection of mysteries and more like a story. A very dangerous story. Show me. Xavier nodded and dimmed the lights. It starts with Eleanor. A photograph appeared on the screen. Eleanor Whitmore stood beside several family members at a gathering decades earlier. Unlike most of the pictures we had found, she looked strong, confident, defiant even. She wasn't just a relative, Xavier explained. She was heavily involved in family financial matters. I know that part. You know part of it. He advanced to the next image. Several legal records appeared. Eleanor's signature existed throughout the documents. For years, she helped oversee certain family trusts. Then why did everyone stop mentioning her? Xavier looked directly at me. Because she became a problem. The answer immediately captured my attention. What kind of problem? The kind that refuses to stay quiet. For the next hour, Xavier walked me through records recovered from attorneys, archived correspondence, and forgotten estate files. A pattern gradually emerged. Eleanor repeatedly challenged decisions made behind closed doors. She questioned trust amendments. She questioned beneficiary changes. Most importantly, she questioned discussions involving me. Every time my name appeared, Eleanor pushed back. Every single time. She was protecting me. Xavier nodded. Looks that way. Why? That's the interesting question. It really was. Eleanor had no legal obligation to protect me. No financial incentive. No obvious reason. Yet according to the records, she fought harder than anyone else. Then Xavier revealed the first major breakthrough. He projected a letter written by Eleanor several months before my abandonment. Most of it consisted of routine family concerns. Then one paragraph caught my attention immediately. Eleanor warned that certain people were becoming more concerned with protecting reputations than protecting family. I read the sentence 3 times. Reputations. Xavier nodded. Not money. My pulse accelerated. Patricia said something similar. Exactly. Suddenly several pieces started fitting together. If reputation mattered more than money, then perhaps the trust wasn't the central issue. Perhaps the trust simply created pressure that exposed something else. Something people desperately wanted hidden. Xavier switched to another document. This one contained notes from a private meeting involving family advisors. Several names appeared repeatedly. Calvin, Patricia, attorneys, Eleanor. Then another name surfaced for the first time. Theodore Whitmore. I frowned. Who is Theodore? Eleanor's younger brother. Interesting. Very interesting. Was he involved? Xavier smiled slightly. More than involved. He handed me another file. Theodore's name appeared throughout multiple records connected to trust discussions. Sometimes as an advisor, sometimes as a participant, sometimes as a witness. The more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. Why hasn't anyone mentioned him? Xavier leaned back in his chair. Maybe because nobody wants you asking questions about him. That answer lingered in my mind. Hours later, after leaving Xavier's office, I returned to the hotel carrying copies of every document. Sleep wasn't possible. My thoughts kept returning to the same questions. Why did Eleanor oppose the decisions? Why did Patricia fear the truth? Why did Calvin avoid specifics? And who exactly was Theodore Whitmore? Around midnight, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. Normally, I ignored unknown calls. This time I answered. Hello? Silence. Then an elderly female voice. You're looking in the right place. I sat upright immediately. Who is this? Someone who knew Eleanor. My heart started pounding. What do you know? The woman hesitated. She spent years trying to protect you. From what? Another silence. Then she delivered a sentence that sent chills down my spine. From what they were willing to become. Before I could ask another question, the call ended. I immediately called back. The number was disconnected. No voicemail, no answer, nothing. The next morning, I met Xavier again. He wasn't surprised by the call. In fact, he seemed almost pleased. That means people are paying attention. People? Whoever still remembers what happened. I hated how much sense that made. The investigation was no longer hidden. Questions were spreading. Old secrets were resurfacing. People connected to those secrets were beginning to notice. Then Xavier handed me another document. Unlike the others, this one wasn't a legal record. It was a personal note written by Eleanor. The final lines caught my attention immediately. If anything happens to me, Isaiah deserves the truth. I stared at the sentence for several seconds. She knew. Knew what? Xavier asked. That someone was hiding something. The room fell silent, because deep down, both of us already believed it. The trust wasn't the secret. The money wasn't the secret. They were distractions. The real secret existed underneath everything. Somewhere in the middle of family pressure, reputation concerns, trust disputes, and 23 years of silence. Then Xavier slid one final photograph across the table. My eyes immediately widened. The image showed Theodore Whitmore standing beside Calvin and Patricia only weeks before my abandonment. All three looked serious. All three appeared to be leaving a private meeting. Written on the back of the photograph was a date. The same week my parents drove me to the Greyhound station. I slowly looked up. I want to meet him. Xavier nodded. I thought you'd say that. Can you find him? A faint smile appeared on his face. Already did. For the first time since beginning the investigation, I felt like I was approaching the center of the maze. Theodore Whitmore wasn't just another name in old records anymore. He was alive. He was connected to the timeline. He was connected to Eleanor. And if the evidence was accurate, he had been standing beside my parents during the exact week my life changed forever. The question was no longer whether Theodore knew the truth. The question was how much of the truth belonged to him. The question was no longer whether Theodore knew the truth. The question was how much of the truth belonged to him. Xavier arranged the meeting 3 days later. During those 72 hours, I reviewed every document connected to Theodore Whitmore. The results were frustrating. The man seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He appeared in trust discussions, legal correspondence, and family records, yet rarely left a direct statement of his own. It was as if he had spent an entire lifetime influencing events from the shadows while allowing others to stand in the spotlight. The more I learned about him, the more uneasy I became. Men like Theodore rarely build power through visibility. They build it through access, through information, through knowing things nobody else knows. The meeting took place at a private club overlooking a golf course north of Atlanta. Expensive, quiet, exclusive. Exactly the kind of place where powerful people preferred conducting business away from public attention. When I arrived, Theodore was already seated on the outdoor terrace. He looked exactly like the photographs, late 70s. Immaculately dressed, calm, controlled. The kind of man who spent decades mastering the art of never revealing what he was thinking. As I approached, he stood and extended his hand. Isaiah. His voice carried no surprise. Thank you for coming. I ignored the handshake and sat down. Theodore smiled faintly before returning to his chair. Straight to business. I respect that. You know why I'm here. Of course I do. The waiter arrived. Theodore ordered coffee. I ordered nothing. Once we were alone again, silence settled between us. Finally, Theodore spoke. You've been asking questions. I've been finding answers. His smile faded slightly. Sometimes answers create more damage than ignorance. That's usually something people say when they're hiding something. For the first time, I saw irritation flicker across his face. It disappeared almost immediately. Fair point. I removed several copies of Eleanor's letters and placed them on the table. Theodore stared at them for several seconds. Then he sighed. I wondered when those would surface. You knew she kept records. Eleanor kept records of everything. There was genuine affection in his voice when he mentioned her name. That surprised me. She didn't trust you. Theodore looked toward the golf course. No, she didn't. Why? Another long silence followed. Finally, he answered. Because she believed I cared more about preserving the family than protecting individuals. The honesty caught me off guard. Most people in his position would deny everything. Theodore wasn't denying. He was explaining. Was she wrong? I asked. Theodore considered the question carefully. Not entirely. We sat in silence for several moments. Then I decided to stop circling around the issue. Did you help convince my parents to abandon me? Theodore's eyes met mine immediately. No. The answer came too quickly to be rehearsed, too directly to be evasive. It sounded true. Unfortunately, truth and innocence aren't the same thing. Did you influence them? Yes. There it was. Finally. How? Theodore leaned back slowly. By telling them what I believed would happen. Which was? That the family was approaching a crisis. Because of me? Partly. Anger surged through me. I was 9 years old. I know. Then explain how a 9-year-old creates a family crisis. Theodore looked older suddenly. Much older. Because adults often create problems and then blame children for exposing them. The statement stunned me. It wasn't the answer I expected. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't self-serving. If anything, it sounded like regret. What problems? I asked. Theodore lowered his eyes. The same problems you've been investigating. Trusts? No. That single word changed everything. Then what? Theodore looked directly at me. Reputation. There it was again. The same word Eleanor referenced. The same idea Patricia hinted at. Reputation. Not money. Not inheritance. Reputation. Whose reputation? Theodore hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his expression. That's where things become complicated. I laughed bitterly. Everyone keeps saying that. Because it's true. I spent the next hour pressing for answers. Theodore answered some questions, avoided others, yet a pattern gradually emerged. The trust wasn't the central issue. The trust merely provided the environment where larger fears developed. Certain information surfaced. Certain family tensions increased. Certain decisions became more desperate. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, people stopped making moral choices and started making strategic ones. The consequences followed. Then I asked the question that changed the entire meeting. Why was Eleanor really fighting? Theodore froze, completely froze. For nearly 10 seconds, he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. Finally, he answered, because she knew something the rest of us didn't. My pulse accelerated instantly. What? Theodore looked away. I don't know. The answer sounded genuine. That bothered me more than a lie would have. You expect me to believe that? Believe whatever you want. His voice suddenly hardened. Eleanor spent years chasing something. She never told me what. I stared at him. Every instinct told me he wasn't lying. At least not about that. Then Theodore surprised me. He reached inside his jacket and removed an old photograph. The image showed Eleanor standing beside a young version of myself near a fishing dock. On the back, written in Eleanor's handwriting, were 6 words. Keep looking. The truth isn't here. I stared at the message for several seconds, then looked up. What does this mean? Theodore's expression darkened. It means Eleanor believed everyone was asking the wrong questions. Including you? Especially me. We sat in silence. For the first time since beginning the investigation, I felt genuinely lost. Every path seemed to lead somewhere important, only to reveal another door behind it, another mystery, another hidden layer. Then Theodore said something I will never forget. Isaiah, your parents made terrible choices. But they weren't the first people Eleanor blamed. Every alarm inside my head activated. Who was? Theodore stared directly into my eyes. Patricia. The world seemed to stop moving. What? Theodore slowly nodded. Long before your disappearance, Eleanor and Patricia were already at war. My pulse hammered inside my chest. Suddenly, dozens of disconnected clues started moving into place. Patricia's fear, Eleanor's letters, the hidden records, the panic whenever Eleanor's name appeared. None of it was random. Why? I asked quietly. Theodore looked exhausted. That's the question Eleanor died trying to answer. That evening, as I drove back toward Atlanta, my phone vibrated. A message from Xavier appeared. Attached was a newly recovered document from Eleanor's estate. The file contained a list of personal storage locations Eleanor maintained during the final years of her life. Most were empty. One wasn't. According to the records, a private storage unit remained active and fully paid until the day Eleanor died. I immediately called Xavier. Tell me you checked it, we tried. And silence. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything once again. The unit exists. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. What's inside? Xavier exhaled slowly. That's the problem. What problem? Another pause. Someone got there before us. Someone got there before us. The words echoed inside my head during the entire drive back to Atlanta. For months, every major discovery had arrived one step too late. Missing documents, dead witnesses, destroyed records. Now, the one location Eleanor had maintained until her death had apparently been accessed before we arrived. That wasn't bad luck. That was intervention. Someone else knew exactly what Eleanor had hidden. More importantly, someone else was still actively protecting it. When? I asked. Xavier's voice remained tense. Less than 3 weeks ago. My pulse accelerated immediately. 3 weeks? According to facility records. The timing couldn't be ignored. 3 weeks ago was almost exactly when I began reconnecting with the Sterling family. Either someone anticipated my investigation or someone panicked when I returned. Neither possibility was comforting. The following morning, Xavier and I visited the storage facility together. The manager met us in a small office near the entrance. After reviewing identification and legal documentation connected to Eleanor's estate, he finally agreed to show us the access logs. I studied every entry carefully. Most visits occurred years apart. Then, a recent signature caught my attention. "Who is this?" I asked. The manager frowned. "That's the problem." "What do you mean?" "The identification used during the last visit was valid, and it belongs to a deceased person." Xavier and I exchanged a glance. Someone had intentionally hidden their identity. That alone confirmed we were dealing with more than family embarrassment. We were dealing with someone willing to plan ahead, someone careful, someone experienced. Several minutes later, we entered the storage unit itself. The space wasn't empty. Far from it. Boxes remained stacked against the walls. Old furniture occupied one corner. Filing cabinets stood unopened. Yet something felt wrong immediately. "Look at the dust," Xavier said quietly. He was right. Certain areas remained untouched for years. Other areas had clearly been disturbed recently. Someone had searched this place. Thoroughly. Methodically. We spent the next 4 hours examining every box, folder, photograph, and document still inside. Most of the contents focused on ordinary family history, old tax records, property files, correspondence, personal journals, valuable information, but nothing explosive. Whoever visited before us knew exactly what they wanted. Then, near the back of the unit, I discovered something unexpected. Hidden beneath a loose wooden panel sat a small metal case. My pulse immediately started pounding. "Xavier." Within seconds, he was beside me. The case showed signs of age but remained locked. Several frustrating minutes later, we finally opened it. Inside sat dozens of photographs, handwritten notes, and a collection of audio cassettes. Real cassettes. The kind people stopped using decades ago. Eleanor had hidden them separately from everything else. For a reason. "Take everything," I said. Back at Xavier's office, the process of digitizing the material took hours. Most recordings contained ordinary conversations, family gatherings, personal reflections, notes Eleanor recorded for herself. Then one tape changed everything. The date attached to the recording placed it approximately 2 months before my disappearance. Several voices participated in the discussion. One belonged to Eleanor, another belonged to Patricia. The argument began calmly before escalating rapidly. "This is wrong," Eleanor said. "You're thinking emotionally," Patricia replied. "I'm thinking morally." Silence followed. Then Eleanor delivered a sentence that made my entire body go cold. "You're willing to sacrifice him to protect yourself." The room around me seemed to disappear. I replayed the recording, then replayed it again. The words never changed. Patricia didn't deny the accusation. She argued about consequences, about pressure, about stability, about protecting the family. But she never denied it. Xavier slowly paused the recording. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he broke the silence. "That's bad. It's worse than bad. Because for the first time, we weren't dealing with interpretations. We weren't dealing with theories. We weren't dealing with assumptions. We were hearing Patricia's own voice." The recording continued for another 20 minutes. By the end, a disturbing picture emerged. Eleanor believed Patricia was hiding something. Something important. Something serious enough to influence decisions involving me. More importantly, Eleanor seemed convinced the truth existed in written form somewhere. She kept mentioning documents, Xavier observed. I noticed. The problem was obvious. If documents existed, where were they? Someone had already searched the storage unit. Someone had already removed materials, which meant the most important evidence might already be gone. Then Xavier noticed something I missed. Listen to this part. He replayed a section near the end of the recording. Eleanor referenced a safety measure, a backup, a place where information would remain protected even if everything else disappeared. My heart immediately started pounding again. A backup. Xavier nodded. That's what it sounds like. Suddenly, hope returned. Eleanor was meticulous, organized, careful, the type of person who wouldn't trust a single hiding place. If she suspected information could disappear, she almost certainly created copies. The question was where. Hours later, while reviewing photographs recovered from the metal case, I noticed something strange. Several images showed Eleanor standing outside the same small building. At first glance, it looked insignificant. Then I noticed the sign above the entrance. A law office. More specifically, a law office belonging to Victor Holloway, the same attorney whose name appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. You have to be kidding me. Xavier looked up. What? I handed him the photograph. Within seconds, his expression changed. Interesting. It was more than interesting. It was a connection. Eleanor, Victor, Patricia, the trust, my disappearance. The same names kept appearing. The same circle kept tightening. That evening, as I prepared to leave the office, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. Again. I answered cautiously. Hello? Several seconds of silence followed, then a familiar voice spoke. Patricia, you need to stop looking. Every muscle in my body tightened. Why? Her breathing sounded uneven, frightened. Because you're getting close. Close to what? Silence. Then she whispered something that changed everything. Eleanor wasn't protecting you from the family. My heart nearly stopped. What are you talking about? Another long pause followed. Then Patricia delivered the sentence that shattered every assumption I had built over the past several weeks. She was protecting you from me. The line went dead. I immediately called back. No answer. Again. No answer. Again. Nothing. I lowered the phone slowly and stared into the darkness outside the office window. For months, every clue had pointed toward trust disputes, family pressure, and hidden financial concerns. Now the center of the entire mystery stood exposed. Not Calvin. Not Theodore. Not the trust. Patricia. Somehow, everything led back to Patricia. And for the first time since beginning the investigation, I realized the person carrying the most guilt might also be carrying the biggest secret. And for the first time since beginning the investigation, I realized the person carrying the most guilt might also be carrying the biggest secret. I didn't sleep that night. Patricia's words replayed endlessly inside my head. Eleanor wasn't protecting you from the family. She was protecting you from me. The statement changed everything. For months, I had viewed Patricia as one participant in a terrible decision. Now I was being forced to consider something much darker. What if Patricia wasn't merely involved? What if she stood at the center of everything? By sunrise, I was already sitting inside Xavier's office. He looked exhausted. I probably looked worse. Neither of us bothered with small talk. Tell me I'm overreacting. Xavier studied me carefully. You're not. I dropped into a chair. Then tell me what I'm missing. Xavier turned his monitor toward me. During the night, he had continued reviewing materials recovered from Eleanor's storage unit. More specifically, he had focused on Eleanor's personal journals, hundreds of pages, thousands of handwritten notes. Most contained routine observations. Then a pattern emerged. Patricia appeared constantly. Not Calvin, not Theodore, Patricia. Look at the dates, Xavier said. I leaned forward. The entries stretched across several years before my disappearance. At first, Eleanor described ordinary disagreements, then the tone gradually changed. Concern became suspicion. Suspicion became alarm. Alarm became fear. My God, Xavier nodded. That's exactly what I said. One entry in particular caught my attention. Eleanor described Patricia as increasingly desperate to prevent certain information from becoming public. Unfortunately, Eleanor never specified exactly what information. Another entry referenced arguments involving family reputation. Another referenced decisions being made out of fear rather than necessity. Then I found the line that stopped me cold. If Patricia succeeds, Isaiah will pay the price. The room became silent. That's years before I disappeared, I whispered. Exactly. My pulse accelerated. Whatever happened wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a single terrible decision made under pressure. It had been building for years, piece by piece, argument by argument, secret by secret. Then Xavier handed me a newly restored transcript from one of Eleanor's recordings. The audio quality had been too damaged to analyze earlier. Now technology had recovered most of the conversation. As I read, a sick feeling settled in my stomach. Eleanor wasn't arguing about trust distributions. She wasn't arguing about inheritance percentages. She was arguing about truth. Specifically, a truth Patricia desperately wanted hidden. Do we know what truth? I asked. Xavier shook his head. Not yet. The answer frustrated me. We were so close. I could feel it. Every clue pointed toward the same destination. Yet the final piece remained missing. Then Xavier's phone rang. He answered, listened for nearly 30 seconds, and suddenly stood up. What? I asked. He covered the receiver. We found Patricia. My heart nearly stopped. Where? Savannah. Less than 4 hours later, I was driving south. Xavier came with me. According to information provided by a private investigator, Patricia had been staying inside a small waterfront rental house under a different name. Not hiding professionally, hiding emotionally. The kind of place someone chooses when running from themselves rather than the police. By late afternoon, we arrived. The house overlooked a quiet marina. Fishing boats drifted slowly across the water. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Patricia opened the door before we knocked, almost as if she had been expecting us. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she stepped aside. Come in. The house was simple, modest. Nothing like the life she had built beside Calvin. No luxury, no image, no performance, just a tired woman sitting alone with her guilt. We settled into the living room. Patricia looked directly at me. For the first time since our reunion, there was no fear in her eyes, only exhaustion. You're going to find out eventually, she said quietly. Then tell me now. She nodded slowly. Fair enough. Several seconds passed. Then she began. 23 years ago, I was terrified. Of what? Losing everything. There was that phrase again. The same phrase Calvin used. The same phrase Eleanor fought against. Everything means what? Patricia stared toward the window. My marriage, my reputation, my future. Why? Her hands tightened around a coffee mug. Because certain questions were being asked. My pulse accelerated immediately. What questions? She looked directly at me. Questions about you. The room felt smaller, much smaller. What kind of questions? Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a moment I thought she might retreat. Instead, she reached into a nearby drawer and removed a thick envelope. Before I answer that, she said quietly, you need to see this. She handed it to me. Inside sat copies of letters, legal notes, personal correspondence, and one document unlike anything I had seen before. My eyes moved across the first page, then stopped, then moved back and read it again. The date matched the year before my disappearance. The names were familiar. Calvin, Patricia, several attorneys, Eleanor. But the subject line changed everything. Paternity review. The world seemed to stop moving. My heartbeat thundered inside my ears. What is this? My voice barely sounded like my own. Patricia closed her eyes. Tears rolled down her face. The beginning of everything. I stared at the document in complete disbelief. For months, I had chased trusts, inheritance disputes, family politics, and financial pressure. Now, suddenly, an entirely different possibility stood in front of me. One capable of explaining every fear, every secret, and every desperate decision. Patricia watched my reaction carefully. Then she whispered the words I never expected to hear. The trust was never the reason you were abandoned. My grip tightened around the papers. Then what was? Patricia's shoulders began trembling. 23 years of lies seemed to collapse all at once. Because someone convinced me your father wasn't your father. The room fell completely silent. Every theory I had built, every assumption, every conclusion. In a single moment, all of them shattered. And deep down, I knew the next truth Patricia revealed would either destroy what remained of my family forever or explain why it had fallen apart in the first place. And deep down, I knew the next truth Patricia revealed would either destroy what remained of my family forever or explain why it had fallen apart in the first place. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The words echoed inside my head. Someone convinced me your father wasn't your father. Every theory I had spent months building suddenly shifted beneath my feet. Trust disputes, family pressure, reputation concerns, financial complications. None of them disappeared. But for the first time, I could see the possibility that they were symptoms rather than causes. Patricia sat quietly across from me, allowing the silence to settle. Tears continued running down her face. Not because she feared my reaction, because she knew what came next. Tell me everything, I said. My voice sounded calm. It wasn't. Patricia slowly nodded. Several months before you disappeared, rumors started spreading inside the family. My pulse accelerated. What rumors? She swallowed hard. That Calvin wasn't your biological father. The room became completely silent. Who started them? Patricia closed her eyes. Nobody ever proved where they began. But people believed them. Yes. The answer came immediately. No hesitation, no excuses. Just truth. For the first time in 23 years, real truth. Patricia explained how a combination of family gossip, old grudges, and private accusations gradually poisoned everything. Certain relatives questioned timelines, others questioned appearances, then someone suggested a paternity test. Once the idea existed, it spread. Fear did the rest. What did Calvin do? I asked. At first, he ignored it. And later? Patricia lowered her head. Later, he started wondering too. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they surprised me, because they revealed how fragile trust becomes once doubt enters a family. Was there ever a test? I asked quietly. Patricia nodded. Yes. My heart immediately started pounding. And? Tears filled her eyes again. It proved Calvin was your father. For several seconds, I simply stared at her. What? The test confirmed it. My mind struggled to process the answer. Then why didn't everything stop? Patricia laughed bitterly. The sound carried decades of regret. Because by then the damage was already happening. Suddenly pieces started falling into place. The rumors created fear. Fear created conflict. Conflict created desperate decisions. Desperate decisions created consequences nobody could control. Theodore knew, Patricia continued. Eleanor knew. The attorneys knew. Eventually, everyone knew the test was positive. Then why was I abandoned? My voice cracked for the first time. Not from anger, from confusion. Patricia's answer arrived almost immediately, because admitting the truth meant admitting what we'd already done. The room felt impossibly quiet. There it was, the answer. Not money, not inheritance, not paternity. Pride, pride and fear. Once the rumors exploded, the family fractured. Temporary decisions were made. Temporary decisions became permanent. Then shame took over. Every year made correction more difficult. Every year made confession more painful. Eventually, the lie became easier to live with than the truth. Eleanor tried to stop it, Patricia whispered. Every day. I looked down at the documents scattered across the table. Suddenly, Eleanor's actions made perfect sense. The letters, the recordings, the hidden evidence. She wasn't fighting over money. She was fighting against cowardice. She hated me near the end, Patricia said softly. No. Patricia looked confused. No? I shook my head. She hated what you became. Tears streamed down Patricia's face. For the first time, she didn't argue. Because deep down, she knew it was true. The next several hours passed in a blur. Patricia gave me everything. Every document. Every recording. Every remaining secret. No more half-truths. No more protection. No more hiding. By the time the sun disappeared beyond the marina, the mystery that had defined my life was finally over. The following week, I returned to Atlanta. A private meeting was arranged. Calvin attended. Patricia attended. Chloe attended. Even Theodore came. Nobody arrived to defend themselves. Nobody arrived expecting forgiveness. They came because the truth finally existed. Complete, undeniable, final. I placed the evidence on the table, then I sat back and allowed them to face it. The room remained silent for a long time. Eventually, Calvin spoke first. I failed you. The statement sounded painfully sincere. Yes, I answered. No anger, no shouting, just truth. Patricia couldn't stop crying. Theodore looked exhausted. Chloe looked devastated. The illusion surrounding the Sterling family had finally collapsed. Not because of scandal, not because of money, because truth eventually demands to be seen. What happens now? Chloe asked quietly. I looked around the room. 23 years earlier, a frightened boy sat alone inside a Greyhound station believing he wasn't wanted. That boy had spent decades searching for answers. Now he finally had them. The answers didn't erase the pain. They didn't restore the lost years. But they removed the burden of uncertainty. Sometimes that is its own kind of freedom. Now, I said calmly, everyone lives with the truth. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Over the following months, relationships slowly changed. Some wounds remained. Others began healing. Calvin stepped away from public leadership and focused on repairing what could still be repaired. Patricia dedicated herself to telling the truth she had avoided for decades. Theodore disappeared from family affairs completely. Chloe worked to rebuild relationships damaged by secrets she never created. As for me, I finally stopped searching. 1 year later, I returned to the Greyhound station where everything began. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Time often does that. I sat alone on the same bench and removed the worn $10 bill I had carried since childhood. For years, I kept it as a reminder of abandonment. Now it meant something different. Survival. I smiled softly and looked around the station. 23 years earlier, I believed my life had ended here. In reality, it had only begun. The people who abandoned me never determined my worth. Their choices revealed their character. My choices revealed mine. As the evening sun filled the station with golden light, I carefully folded the bill and returned it to my wallet. Then I stood and walked toward the exit. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer owned me. And for the first time since I was 9 years old, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward the life that had always belonged to me.